This is Garis, masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 540, entitled "The Key to Men's Lib is the FIPping of Women." Description. This flyer spells out how important the FIPping of women is to free men from the big three ways that women oppress men for decades of men's lives. By living in a FIP society with the FIPping of women, men's lib becomes much more practical. So masculists put enormous moral pressure on women to FIP up, or they are killed off slowly by being totally ignored to death. Now, the flyer itself. The key to men's lib is the FIPping of women, by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. In the manosphere, in brackets, that is men on the internet who discuss men's issues, close brackets, the largest video platform of its kind is MGTOW.tv, that I contribute regularly to. I do notice that I'm the only one who takes a deliberate political stance to men's lib, that is, to political masculism, pushing for not only fundamental changes in people's expectations of men, but for major structural changes in the gender laws that will influence the lives of billions of men across the planet, in brackets, e.g. the legislation of the para, that's paternity rejection right, fundamental reform of the divorce courts, the creation of gender equality committees, GECs, in the parliaments that address the gender issues of both sexes equally, etc. So I feel I have quite a responsibility to provide a grand strategy on how to liberate billions of men, since no one else, as far as I can make out, is doing this. So I give quite a lot of thought to what needs to be done so that billions of men can be liberated from the oppressions inflicted on them by women and the massive injustices thrust on them by very bad gender laws. The more I think about how men suffer in their billions, in brackets, literally billions with a B, the more I come to the conclusion that the key to the liberation of men from their decades of man's slavery, that is, working for decades of their lives for a woman who does not bother to FIP up, from the butchery that men suffer at the hands of the hated fluffy feminist-controlled divorce courts, from forced fatherhood due to men not having the para, paternity rejection right, when women have the mara, maternity rejection right, etc., is the critical importance of women FIPping up and realizing that by living in a FIP society, most of men's oppression would be lifted. So this flyer spells out how critical it is that women FIP up, that society sees the FIPping of women, so that men can be liberated from decades of oppression at the hands of fluffy women. More explicitly, this flyer shows how the FIPping of women will remove most of the major ways that women oppress men, and in fact worse than vice versa. It lists the big three ways that women oppress men and explains how the FIPping of women will remove these big three oppressions, plus a few other important ways that women oppress men. I begin with the far and away biggest way that women oppress men, and that is their man-slavery of men, expecting men to work for women for decades of their lives so that women can stay at home for decades raising her kids for a couple of years, and for the remaining decades she sits on her fat parasitic ass and lives off his labour and money. The masculists claim that it was men who liberated women from household drudgery, since it was men who gave women science-based medicine. So women now have a life expectancy of 85 years. Men gave women the pill, household gadgets, higher education, etc. So women have a career window of half a century. Masculists then stand up and point the finger at women, telling them that, quote, now that women can work, they must work, since anything else is man's slavery, and man's slavery is hated by the masculists, who punish man's slavers severely by forcing them to rot on the shelf, by being totally ignored by masculisted men, not even pumped and dumped and spat at, reviled for being hated, manslaving parasites. Now, it's obvious that in a FIP society, that is one in which both sexes are FIPs, that is a society in which the FIPping of women is the norm and the custom, then decades-lasting fluffydom would not exist, since nearly all women would be FIPs, who do not expect to live off the money and labour of a man, manslaving him for decades of his life. Of course, some compromise is needed from the masculists when the kids are very small, when the mother needs to be breastfeeding them, etc. And for this, the masculists are proposing the creation of CMTs, that is, career mother timelines, which map out over time how a woman can be both a careerist, that is a FIP, and a mother of 2 kids, which will need to become the norm in the near future, or we wipe ourselves out as generation after generation fails to reproduce itself by having a birth rate well under the replacement rate of 2.1 children per woman. As an example of a CMT for a woman with a master's degree level of intelligence, she gets her master's at age 23, works for 5 years in her FIP career, earning good money and gaining real job experience. In those 5 years, she meets and marries her husband. She then gets pregnant and has her first kid at age 29 and her second kid at age 31. 4 years later, at age 35, her second kid is off to kindergarten and she goes back to work. For the 6 years that she has been out of the workforce, the government gives her a motherhood wage to soften the stress load on her husband, who otherwise would have the full burden of earning the living for the entire family. But women have a career window of half a century, so just looking at the numbers, one sees that women have a powerful moral obligation to pull their financial weight equally by bothering to get a career-competent education so that they can be FIPs as adults and not expect, fluffy style, to be able to parasite off the labour and money of a man for decades of his life. Fluffies are hated by masculists. They are seen as manslavers and hence as slavers and therefore hated. Masculists are at war against fluffies who aim to wipe them out by totally rejecting them, by totally ignoring them, not even pumping and dumping them, forcing them to rot on the shelf. Masculists spit at fluffies, making their lives miserable, so that young fluffies feel tremendous moral pressure to FIP up or be utterly rejected by their male classmates and work peers, who will reject them both socially and sexually, causing these fluffy women to become so depressed and rejected that many of them will choose to suicide. Since the masculists are at war against fluffies, they will have little sympathy for the deaths of fluffy manslaving parasites, since there is, after all, a war on, a sex war, a gender war, a war to wipe out fluffies. To masculists, the recipe to wipe out manslavery is to wipe out fluffies, and to wipe out fluffies is to see the FIPping of women by putting enormous moral pressure on young women to FIP up by bothering to get career competent educations so that they can be FIPs as adults and not be fluffies. Young women will pour into the STEM fields and the professions with masculist slogans ringing in their ears, such as, quote, "No calculus, no baby," quote, "Be FIP or be manless," quote, "If you want to get a man, get a career," etc. Young women who get the reputation within their social circle, their high school, of being a fluffy, will feel the kiss of death with their chances of getting a man. Their male classmates will spit at them to their face and utterly reject them socially and sexually, making the lives of these young fluffies utterly miserable to the point of suicide. The second major way that women badly oppress men is the butchery of fathers in the hated, fluffy, feminist-controlled divorce courts. These divorce court lawyers and judges are usually feminists, monoconscious feminists, who know nothing about masculism, so by default have traditional expectations of men, that is, seeing men as cash machines to pay for women to have babies. They see men before the divorce as cash machines, since that is their expectation of men. So after the divorce, they merely continue the same expectation, with one difference, that the father is no longer in the house with the children. He loses custody of his kids with a 90% probability. He loses his house to his ex-wife, forced to pay her half of his wealth and stuff, made to make child payments to his kids, whom he will barely be allowed to see. And if his ex-wife is a real fluffy, he may be forced to pay her alimony for the rest of his life, with no moral nor legal obligation on her to get off her fat parasitic ass and FIP up. Thus he continues to be man-slaved after the divorce as before the divorce. Of course, masculists are murderously hateful at this butchery that happens to one father in 4, that is, to millions of men across the world every year. Masculists have an even greater hatred of these fluffy feminists who control the divorce courts, since they butcher the lives of one father in 4, seeing men as cash machines to be abused and robbed. Masculists have an even greater hatred of these fluffy feminists, since it is bad enough that they are fluffies and hence manslavers. But they are seen by the masculists to be also hypocrites and genociders. Hypocrites because these fluffy feminists want equal rights with men in the parliaments, but reject equal obligations with men to share equally the burden of earning the living by not bothering to get career competent educations at high school, so that they become fluffies as adults who expect to be able to manslave a man for decades of his life. The fluffy feminists who control the divorce courts are thus fluffies and hence manslavers, and are hated by the masculists. The masculists are pushing hard for the fundamental reform of the divorce courts by throwing out alimony, giving both parents joint custody of the kids by default. The person who owns the house gets to keep it, and divorce is made to operate under the principle of financial independence. That is, it's assumed that the women, the divorcing mothers, are true FIPs who have bothered to get career competent educations so that they are capable of pulling their own financial weight and not expect to parasite off the money and labour of a man. This is the end of part 1.